Gaius Antonius, governor of Macedonia, 43 BCE. The younger brother of Mark Antony, Gaius Antonius came of age just in time to become a major player in the civil wars that marked the end of the Republic. We know less about Gaius than both his older brother, the triumvir, and his unpredictable younger brother, Lucius. Yet, on the basis of two known failures and a few derogatory remarks from Cicero's Philippics, modern scholars have no hesitation dismissing Gaius Antonius as a prime example of someone who was grossly incompetent and owed everything to nepotism. While I cannot and will not argue that Gaius was successful or that he was ever able to come close to proving his worth, I will argue that he has been judged a bit hastily. If we look at the challenges that he faced, it becomes apparent that Gaius Antonius's assignments were always difficult, that he was asked to operate on a shoestring, and that he was consistently undermined by the people around him, friend and foe alike. In the end, Gaius Antonius was not a disgraceful failure like his father and uncle, but simply a man destroyed primarily by circumstances beyond his own control. When Gaius Antonius was born, the name Antonius brought up mixed associations, both in terms of their political leanings and of their capabilities. The last two generations had seen quite a bit of turbulence and some shifting in their alignment. The grandfather of the Antonii, Marcus Antonius the Orator, was a widely respected member of the Senate. He was probably among the best orators of his day, certainly among the top 3 or 4. He served as consul in 99 and censor in 97. He was also an outspoken member of the faction that would later come to be called the Optimates, and it was his outspoken conservatism which ultimately got him executed by Cinna, the successor of Marius, in 87. The father of the Antonii, Marcus Antonius Creticus, would prove to be far less of a Marcus Antonius than his father or his son, the later triumvir. In fact, his cognomen Creticus was a mocking punishment from his colleagues in the Senate. Not only did he fail to conquer Crete and was mocked for his failed conquest, but the name Creticus can have a double meaning in Latin, man of chalk, meaning that this man was full of hot air, effectively, that he was not made of anything. A couple years after he failed in Crete and had to sign a shameful peace in order to get away with the remnants of his force, he died out of shame. This means that Gaius, who was born perhaps around the year 80 or so, was without his father from about the age of 8. And perhaps that contributed to how close he was with his two brothers, Marcus and Lucius. The uncle of Gaius Antonius was his namesake, Gaius Antonius Hybrida. Hybrida was a notorious rogue. His cognomen means half-beast, and he earned that by being a rather brutal governor in Greece. Hybrida was also implicated in the Catilinarian conspiracy, and many people saw him as a diehard ally of Catiline until it became clear that Catiline's was a losing cause. It was actually Antonius Hybrida who was technically in command when Catiline was defeated in the field. Nonetheless, Antonius Hybrida, despite never officially losing favor, was seen as one of the less reputable consuls in the Senate. Perhaps the most important relation in the boys' lives, however, was Julia, the mother of the Antonii. She was the sister of Lucius Julius Caesar, the consul of 64. If your father died and your uncle was a bit of a rogue, then having another uncle on the maternal side who was a well-respected consul was a boon, and just having Lucius Julius Caesar alone would have been enough to ensure that the 3 Antonii brothers would have been able to make it to some extent in the Senate. However, more importantly, Lucius Julius Caesar and Julia were cousins with Gaius Julius Caesar, who by the time that the boys came of age was a triumvir, about to embark on a conquest of Gaul. This meant that opportunities for employment and advancement were many, and they were also no doubt aware that of the members of the triumvirate, it was Caesar who was the rising star, and Pompey and Crassus, who were losing ground in relative terms. We know that Mark Antony, Marcus Antonius that is, was born in 83, and that Gaius and Lucius were born soon thereafter. I estimate Lucius was born in 78 for reasons I'll get into when I cover him, and I'm guessing Gaius was born about the year 80. The three brothers were very close, probably because of losing their father at such a young age, as I mentioned, and because of the identity of various members of their family, they did have some ties with both factions. But for the most part, they were all in with the populares, and by the time they come of age in the 50s, it is appropriate to speak of the optimates and populares, because by this point, these are well-defined factions. In 49, Caesar famously cast the die and crossed the Rubicon. This is the same year that Gaius Antonius emerges onto the pages of history, and it was precisely because Caesar needed guys exactly like him. When he crossed the Rubicon and declared war on the Senate, this led most of his officers to desert. Therefore, Caesar had a strong army of 8 legions, but a weakened officer corps, and he was looking for anyone who was loyal and who qualified. Gaius Antonius fit the bill perfectly, not least because Caesar's new chief lieutenant was Mark Antony, his older brother. Antony was left in charge of Italy as a whole, and Gaius was left in charge of Illyricum, the connecting fiber between Italy and the Balkans, and a place that is generally difficult to hold due to the presence of various barbarian groups that had not been fully pacified and the rough terrain. In addition, he was to work with Publius Cornelius Dolabella, Cicero's son-in-law, and a man who seems to be simultaneously deeply arrogant and probably not very good at his job. So Gaius was stuck trying to hold this area with a mere reinforced legion, most likely the 9th Legion, and he didn't know what Pompey might try. Famously, Caesar wanted Gaius to hold the line in Illyricum while he took the main force to Spain. His strategy was to defeat the army without a general before turning on the general without an army, i.e. Pompey in Greece. Dolabella proved to be not a very good partner here, and his fleet was defeated. Gaius Antonius had his own ships and tried to go salvage the situation, ending up at Charicta, an island in the Adriatic. Here he was captured along with all 15 of his cohorts, and they were integrated into the Pompeian army. Exactly what happened is unclear, and we don't get a full account from anyone. However, Caesar does fill us in with one detail in his commentaries on the Civil War, and that is that Antonius's defeat owed in large part to the 9th Legion centurion Titus Puleo. Puleo was someone Caesar respected in some ways because he was a man who actually helped contribute to a minor defeat that Caesar suffered in Greece. So Titus Puleo was someone not to be taken lightly, and almost certainly someone who had greater experience than Gaius Antonius. The upshot of the whole campaign in Illyricum and the disaster here is that Caesar lost a potential avenue of advance and had to do the daring crossing of the Adriatic in the face of Bibulus's fleet. He had to do this twice, first with his main force and second with Antony's half. During the whole campaign that would culminate at Pharsalus, Gaius Antonius was a prisoner of war and took no further part. While he clearly did not do well, it is worth noting again that his colleague was not exactly of the highest caliber, and the man who betrayed him was well known for his military abilities. Despite Gaius's initial failure in Illyricum, which in some ways was a fitting prologue for a campaign where Caesar was almost always on the back foot, Caesar was able to prevail, and Mark Antony, Gaius's brother, was able to conduct himself well enough. It's worth noting, however, that there had been some tension between Caesar and Antony during the course of the early going of the Civil War. Caesar thought that Antony's handling of Italy was poor, and there were also rumors that Antony had held back from bringing the reinforcements that he had promised Caesar, perhaps because people in Pompey's camp were making threats against the life of his brother Gaius. We'll never know, of course, but there are sources that record that Antony considered letting Caesar die and reconciling with the Senate. At any rate, the two of them did reconcile, and not only did they make things good, but Caesar then effectively promoted Mark Antony by really confirming him as his number 2 man. When Caesar was dictator, Mark Antony was master of horse. And while Antony was being rewarded, his brothers were also reaping the benefits. Caesar's plan was to go east to fight Parthia in 44 in order to avenge the defeat that Crassus had suffered at Carrhae in 53. And he was effectively leaving the Antonii in full charge of Rome. Mark Antony would become consul, and he would be effectively in charge. Caesar, who was absent, would be his colleague, and then Gaius would be praetor, and Lucius would be tribune. So between them, they would control military power, the courts, and the People's Assembly. And if we think in broader terms of the relatively small size of Caesar's immediate family, and the fact that Lucius Julius Caesar was getting old, he was probably 5 years older than Caesar, the Antonii were very much set up to be the major beneficiaries of Caesar's new order. At worst, they would be in the same position that, say, Lucullus was in when Sulla died. And, as we all know, things did not quite go the way that Caesar had planned, because other men had a plan that involved stabbing him 20-something times and leaving him dead. Given that Gaius was at the time an active praetor, there's every reason to believe that he was in the theater of Pompey at the time when Caesar was assassinated. We don't know exactly what he thought at the time, but we have to imagine that he was every bit as terrified for his life as his older brother was. Most likely, also like his older brother, he was more than happy to agree to the terms of the Liberatores, namely that they wanted to make a peace settlement rather than try to fight it out. The settlement that was reached between the assassins and the Caesarians was that Caesar's appointments for the next 2 years would all hold. That would work out well for the Antonii, among others. The veterans of Caesar would receive their lands and payments. That would avoid mutinies. And in exchange, the assassins would all be pardoned. Free elections would then be held for 41. The Republic would march on. While this was naive on the part of the Liberatores, it did provide much needed breathing room for Antony and his brothers. Now, Gaius Antonius was not figured in to receive a major pro-praetorian governorship the following year in Caesar's scheme. Antony, however, was. He was to go to Macedonia, where he could both keep an eye on Italy and potentially provide reinforcements to Caesar, who was going to be in Parthia. But Antony decided that the real action was up in Cisalpine Gaul, so he used his influence to rig the lot to make sure that he got Cisalpine Gaul instead of Decimus Brutus, and he also ensured that Gaius, as a pro-praetor, would get Macedonia. Again, none of this had been in the original plan, and this really made the Liberatores nervous for good reason. They could see that Antony was gearing up for war, and that they needed to do something to avoid giving him an upper hand. As for Gaius, this of course was great news. He was about to get a wealthy province with troops. It was near Italy, so he could either reinforce his brother or provide his brother with refuge if his fight against Octavian went the wrong way. By this time, Antony and Octavian were already fighting over Caesar's estate. Both of them had a claim, and both of them were not really very close relatives. However, Caesar had opted to give his name and estate to his grandnephew rather than his cousin. But in many ways, it's not hard to see why the Antonii thought that their claim to be Caesar's closest heirs was just as good as Octavian's, especially since their relationship with him went back much longer. Octavian and Caesar had only really met a year or two before Caesar's death. Gaius Antonius left Rome in late 44, intending to get to Macedonia by January of 43. He did not take the most direct route, and he does not seem to have been in a hurry. In fact, Cicero in his 10th Philippic tries to make Gaius's leisurely pace sound suspect. The irony, of course, is that Cicero himself, on several known occasions, according to his own letters, took leisurely paths himself, mostly for sightseeing or for visiting estates or visiting friends. There are plenty of reasons why a Roman senator might do something like that. Business interest, sightseeing, reminiscing, hookups, who knows. Cicero tells us that Gaius stopped in Dyrrhachium, Apollonia, and Illyricum, all of which were outside of Macedonia. He says that this is inherently suspect. I would say, by way of refutation, however, that Dyrrhachium and Apollonia are both ports that one can use to access the Balkans and then travel overland. Neither of those destinations is necessarily suspect, and Illyricum may be a little bit, since Illyricum is the overland route. But at any rate, Cicero seems to be making quite a bit of the fact that Gaius made a few stops before he tried to go to Macedonia. And the reason why he's doing this is to justify the actions of his allies in Greece, who were effectively trying to deprive Gaius of his governorship. In the event, it's even possible that Cicero was right, that Gaius was looking for opportunities and invasion routes and trying to feel out some of the governors in those areas to see where their loyalties lay. But at any rate, the idea in itself that making an indirect journey was suspect was laughable, as that was very much the norm, so far as we can tell, for Roman senators. While it isn't completely clear that Antony's reshuffling of the provincial commands was aimed directly at the liberatories as a group, he may have just really hated Decimus Brutus, it did alarm all of the liberatories, and they began to take defensive measures. They knew that if Antony had his loyal men in all of the commands across the Republic, that he most likely would wage war against them and become a new Caesar. And so they started scrambling, looking for ways to combat Antony. Back in Rome, they began to befriend Octavian, the young heir of Julius Caesar. And in the provinces, they began to figure out ways to deprive Antony's allies of command. Their main target at this time was none other than Gaius Antonius. Gaius, of course, had been making his leisurely way to his command, and by the time he gets there, right before it's time to take over, he realizes that all is already lost. By the time he arrives, Marcus Cicero Minor, Cicero the Younger, who had been studying rhetoric in Athens, had arrived in order to take command of the local legion away from the loyal Antonian Lucius Piso. Apparently Piso was either taken by surprise, his men defected, or else he simply switched sides. At any rate, the major force in the area was now in the hands of someone loyal to the assassins. The leader of this effort was Marcus Junius Brutus, one of the leaders of the liberatories on the Ides of March. Ever since the event, due to his deep unpopularity with the people of Rome, Brutus had taken a sojourn in Athens to study philosophy. He came out of his studies with renewed vigor and invented a new command for himself. He now claimed sweeping authority over the entirety of the Balkans, and he declared that he was now uniting the commands of Illyricum, Macedon, and Greece. In his efforts to do this, he had the support of the outgoing governor, Quintus Hortensius Hortulus, who declared for Brutus and became a legate. This, of course, is the Hortensius who is the son of the famous orator. So by the time that Gaius lands with 7 cohorts at Apollonia, he finds that he's outnumbered, and all of the officials who are supposed to legally hand him power have refused to do so and are determined to fight him. We don't know exactly how long it took, but within a month or so of his landing, he was defeated, his men had defected, and he was a POW once again. As with Gaius's earlier failure in Illyricum, we do not know the exact sequence of events, and so we can't really point to any specific mistakes that he made. We could say that he was a bit dilatory in arriving in Macedonia, but as I pointed out earlier, that was not all that unusual. It's also possible that he had heard rumblings of Brutus writing to people in Illyricum and elsewhere, and that he was investigating those rumors, and that's why he made those pit stops. I think it is quite telling that in the same speech where Cicero tries to raise suspicions about Antonius's travels, that he effectively argues that the Senate should confirm Brutus as the new governor of the entire Balkans. So in many ways, he might just be projecting what Brutus had been planning onto Gaius Antonius. At any rate, we'll never know the truth about what Antonius was doing when he was traveling there and what he did once he found out that the fix was in. From all appearances, though, it appears to me at least that Gaius Antonius was defeated before he ever had a chance to do anything. Now, given that he was the brother of Mark Antony, Gaius was a valuable hostage, and so most likely he was treated very well from a material standpoint. He most likely got to dine with Brutus and others. And given how poorly his brother's war was going at Mutina once Octavian advanced with Pansa and Hirtius, Gaius was probably pretty worried about his own future and felt that he was about to suffer a big demotion. He most likely did not think, however, that he was going to lose his life, since he had surrendered and he was in the care of the supposedly honorable Brutus. However, when the tables turned in Italy, when Antony made common cause with Octavian and was fighting against Decimus Brutus, Antony arranged for Decimus Brutus, one of his most bitter enemies, to be murdered by a Gallic chieftain in September of 43, and this led Brutus, Marcus Brutus, the philosopher, the man of great virtue, to decide that it was important to reciprocate, and so he decided that Gaius Antonius had to die, even though Gaius Antonius again had taken refuge with him as a prisoner. We don't know exactly when the execution took place. It may have been immediately, or it may have been delayed for over a year until the eve of Philippi in October 42. But at any rate, Gaius Antonius was executed because of something that his brother did in Italy. At Philippi, the combined forces of Antony and Octavian overcame the combined forces of Brutus and Cassius. Brutus, when all was lost, decided to commit suicide rather than be captured. Antony was conducted to his body, and despite still being absolutely livid with Brutus for his decision to execute Gaius Antonius without cause, Antony decided to play the noble Roman and cover Brutus's body with his purple command cloak. Most likely, Antony did not respect Brutus in any way, but he knew that because of Brutus's reputation, it was important for his reputation to show respect to the man. However, Antony's anger had still not been expressed properly, and he was determined to take his pound of flesh for Gaius's unneeded death. The man he turned to get revenge was Quintus Hortensius Hortulus, the governor of Macedonia, whose job it was to turn his command over lawfully to Gaius. It was Hortensius's involvement, probably in Antony's mind, that had been key to his brother's capture and ultimate demise. And so, taking Hortensius as his personal captive, Antony took him by force to Gaius's gravesite, and there drew out his own sword and killed the man over Gaius's grave. Whatever else you might say about Mark Antony, he was a man of action, and he loved his brothers. That much he proved at Philippi. Gaius Antonius doesn't really have that much of a legacy, partly because he didn't live long enough to make one. However, I still think that he has more significance than is immediately apparent. He's often simply dismissed by modern scholars as yet another example of someone who was completely incompetent, but was elevated due to his family name. That is a reading that remains plausible. I have not claimed at any time that I've fully refuted it. What I have attempted to point out, however, is that it is a bit hasty and premature to say that he was flamingly incompetent, given that his known commands were situations where almost no one would succeed. As we talked about in both Illyricum and Macedonia, he was facing opponents from both within and without. He didn't have a lot of resources on hand, and he was betrayed while also being attacked from the outside. So these are not the kind of circumstances that are going to be conducive to building up a winning record. And because he was a POW during a whole lot of the fighting, his opportunities were limited. However, I think his greater significance is in his absence from the later stages of the Civil War period, specifically the Second Triumvirate period, where Mark Antony needed allies he could trust and people who could give him good advice, people who were level-headed and who could prevent him from making mistakes. Lucius, the youngest brother, was not that guy, and in fact he got Antony into a heap of trouble that we'll talk about when we get to Lucius. But Gaius might have been that guy. He might have been, despite his mediocrity, someone who was relatively level-headed. One of the pieces of evidence for that is that in the 14 Philippics that Cicero put out about Mark Antony and his brothers, you'll notice that there are no specific allegations about Gaius in terms of him being a bad person. Cicero just paints him by association as being a terrible person, but he doesn't really have too many specific charges to level against Gaius. So Gaius might not have been that bad of a guy. And even if he were just a mediocre guy who did his job and did it at a very average level, if he did have some degree of caution, and if Mark Antony respected him, that still could have gone a long way between 42 and 30, because Antony often needed someone there to keep him balanced and focused. And Gaius, even if he was not some sort of genius, could have played that role potentially. So really, the significance of Gaius Antonius is simply that he might have been the anchor that Antony needed during the Second Triumvirate, because I stand by what I've said in the past, namely that Antony was the odds-on favorite to be the last man standing of the Second Triumvirate up until almost the end. And if he had just had one stabilizing force in place, that might have been all the difference. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Gaius Antonius. Thank you for joining me. In the near future, we'll also be looking at the youngest of the three Antonii, Lucius. So I hope that you will join me for that as well.